So for everyone out there who may not be familiar, just can you give me a brief setup to who you are and what you do?
Sure, man. Well, my name's Patrick Lovell, and I have been a television producer, film producer, producer of media for a long time, over a couple of decades. I started off in LA working in Hollywood, and then I ended up doing television projects. I became an action sports producer, to be honest with you, and then I did a bunch of entertainment stuff. And then I became a television producer on a nationally syndicated television show, giving away houses all over the country. And that was in 2006 and 7. And that was my entry to why we're talking.
So what were you doing as a sports producer?
Oh, I've done everything from football to professional sports to, extreme skiing, snowboarding, mountain climbing, mountain biking, all that sort of stuff, Red Bull type stuff.
Your documentary, you haven't released this documentary series yet. That's called The Con.
Right.
It's how did you get interested? What lit the flame for you? And started your interest in the 2008 financial crisis, and basically what inspired you to make this thing?
I got buried. So I was living the one-on-one version of the American dream. Like I said, I've been a producer for some time and I was relatively successful. And I was literally giving away houses as a senior producer on a show that we had about 40 people working for us and traveling all over the country, telling really good stories. It was kind of like a home makeover show. Wasn't my cup of tea. Like I've been writing scripts and wanting to produce big Hollywood action blockbusters forever. So, I could take it or leave it, but it was a really cool experience because I got to connect with a lot of great people around the country. And oddly enough, I was always scratching my head because it wasn't like a normal home makeover show. I mean, what it was a front for mortgage lending. The people that were the executive producers of the show back then, and we're talking circa 2006, 7, 8, they were a huge commercial real estate developer and residential developer out of Seattle. They had projects all over the United States. These guys were flying around in G5s one day, all over the world. So much money had made your head spin. And then all of a sudden in September, I wouldn't say September, it was more like July of 2007, when our show was really off and running, these guys would go bankrupt overnight. On the show, we were like, what the hell was that? That doesn't make any sense. And so I go from, being in my first house. I've got a young family at the time. I'm married. My son is, very young at the time. And I got into my first house. I was making good money. I basically at the time, and I'm quite a bit older than you, but at that time, you could go to the bars, man, and you'd meet up and hang out with people that were freaking flipping houses like crazy. Everybody had money. Everybody was blowing cake like it was like no tomorrow, right? And so everybody's living high on the hog. And then the next thing you know, suddenly the wheels fall off. And I'm like, what the heck just happened? Now, I'm a producer. I'm a business guy. I know contract law. I know how things are done. I'm not a chum. But yet suddenly I'm in this situation where it's like nothing makes sense. Honestly, the media didn't make sense. The stuff that was happening in government at the time didn't make sense. We had just transitioned from Bush to Obama. He rides this personal mandate wave from the people to create a new beginning because the wheels just fell off the economy. And the stuff that was coming out of the White House at the time and the stuff that I was dealing with in the aftermath of the 2008 collapse didn't speak to my experience. And so as a producer and somebody who's been, I've been into watching great detective films my whole life. I mean, I guess I was a product of the Oliver Stone generation, Martin Scorsese, that sort of thing. And so, nothing would really surprise us coming out of that era, right? I mean, we grew up with like Pablo freaking Escobar in Colombia and Contragate and you name it. So we knew crazy stuff was happening or could happen, but yet I think we thought at the time that particularly, well, growing up in that time period, that the long arm of the law would always catch up with wrongdoing. I mean, that was just kind of the idea of America, right? We knew there's criminals and we knew that there would be consequences. Well, coming from that sort of background, it would never occur to me in the great financial crisis what actually happened. And so ultimately, the reason I tee it up that way is because when shit hit the fan and my life collapsed and I was basically spit out of a cannon into a desert with my family on my back and nowhere to turn, because you could not make money at that time. Money just evaporated, right? And so I start going through this foreclosure crisis, and I'm like, all right, nothing makes sense. I got to figure out what's going on. And long story short, I got lucky enough to put a project together with some very, very important people and people that have become my family. And that put in motion basically what became a 9-year journey to discover the biggest gargantuan mammoth conspiracy lie of all time. Then we're right in the middle of it.
So at that time, were you a victim of this predatory lending that was going on, or?
Oh, for sure. But I wouldn't at that time ever admit to it because I didn't know what predatory lending was. So I know you've got some fluency, right? I think you talked to a guy who was a mortgage broker and a lender,
Yeah.
and who went to prison, I believe, if I read the thumbnail correctly, for quite a bit of time, or at least he was sentenced to quite a bit of time. So you probably have a pretty good understanding of what was happening on the lending side, all of the different types of products.
He was a mortgage lender, and he eventually got sentenced to 26 years and ended up only doing 12.
Okay.
But
what did you learn from that?
Well, basically what he did was he did a lot of what was talked about in the documentary. Like, he was falsifying bank statements, people's income. And he did that. He started working at the bank, learning, from his coworkers that, hey, you want to close this loan, you want a couple grand, this is how you do it. So then
for the fees.
Exactly.
Yep.
And then so he eventually branched out. He saw the opportunity in it. And so he started doing it himself with houses.
There you go.
So he started basically creating fake people and getting mortgages with fake identities.
Yes, we're very unfortunately aware of that.
So yeah, that's the extent that I'm aware.
Okay. So you saw, I believe, our pilot episode, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So were you surprised by some of the things that you saw unfold in that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff I wasn't aware of. Like, I wasn't aware of the fact that there was these lenders walking around neighborhoods, knocking on doors, trying to basically sell them these fake mortgages, or basically convince them to refinance their house for triple what it was worth. And I didn't know they were doing that, walking through the inner cities of Ohio, preying on the low income people of those cities.
Yes, that's where the whole thing begins. All right. And it's been going on for a very long time. So I'll pick up there. Okay. Because you're familiar with what that story is, and I'll try to.
Yeah, I think it would be good to do this sort of like in a timeline. So I think that was the beginning of it. So which year was that?
Well, the way we open episode 1, which is our pilot episode, it is through the horrific, tragic story of an elderly African-American woman by the name of Addie Polk. At the time, she was 91 years old. She had lived in her home for over 4 decades. And right at the height of the crash, right in September of 2008, the sheriff's department had sent out, like they do, and you saw this like crazy in Florida, of course. Right. They send out, their officers to basically evict people from their homes, right? Because they didn't pay their mortgage. There's a foreclosure action. They've got to leave, right? The property's going to get pulled back into the bank, right? So in her case, prior to that, she was informing the people that were leaving the notices of foreclosure. She called them, and you got to imagine she's an elderly woman, right? Right. And she's saying, I own my house. How's this possible that someone's trying to, it just didn't make any sense to her. But she didn't have somebody she could go to, or an attorney, or she didn't have the capacity to just up and figure out, or quite frankly, the resources to, go into the court system and challenge what was happening. And even if she did, as we know from what happened in Florida, she would have been overwhelmed by it no matter what. But so as the sheriff came to evict her, facing homelessness at the age of 91, especially after she was being evicted from a home that she lived in for decades, that she and her husband were able to purchase and own outright, because, another tragic part of the story is that, as we all know, African Americans in this country have been fighting a massive, massive uphill battle really from the beginning. And part and parcel to that was after the Civil War, we get in Reconstruction, which leads to Jim Crow. And a lot of people a lot of African Americans from the agrarian Southeast, particularly, relocated in a mass exodus to the Midwest because in the wake of World War II, we had industrialization and the factories needed workers. So they hired African Americans to replace the GIs that were fighting in World War II. And so Addie and her husband Robert were a part of that migration. And as a result, he worked his life to the bone, 2 jobs apiece to provide for his wife. They were regular churchgoers, like most people in the African community of that era, specifically from the South. They always lived within like walking distance of their church. And so here's a woman of faith, a woman of incredible dignity. And she and her husband literally put their life into that home, which for anyone who knows African Americans know that when they got a home that they owned, it was a great source of pride and achievement. And this is who Addie Polk was. And then suddenly she's in this situation where she's being physically evicted from her home, and she apparently doesn't know why. And now that might be hard for people to believe, right? But it's not hard to believe for someone like you who knows a guy who's doing a lot of document fabrication and all the things you just prefaced, because that's also known as straw buying, and I'll get into that in a minute. But faced with this ultimate tragedy, poor Addie Polk, man, she pulled a gun out, her husband's gun, and shot herself in the chest 5 times. Unbelievably, it didn't kill her immediately. She died 6 months later from complications of those wounds.
Oh my God.
And and she died. And so my partners and I, we had already, because of the length of time it took to put this thing together, like you asked, how did I come to it? Well, I lost my home, and I'm not a chump. I knew something was wrong. Nothing was adding up based on what media was saying, what government was saying, and what my experience was. And I'm like, I got to figure out what's going on here. Now, for a lot of folks that probably are listening to you in Florida, many people either themselves went through this process or they knew somebody. And a lot of people out of Florida became what we call pro se litigants. And pro se litigants are people that are pretty smart. They know they've been played, and they're going to figure out why and how they got played. And they go through the court system representing themselves. And a lot of these people ended up learning just about everything you can know from the system without having a lot of resources, right? So I ended up kind of being like that in a sense, but I'm a producer. I couldn't do that as a part-time job to save my life. I mean, these people, to understand this stuff, you kind of have to get a master's in criminology. You literally have to recontextualize your entire life. You got to understand policy. You got to understand judicial procedure. You got to understand real estate law. You got to understand all of these variables that you never had any idea. But what happens and what's common in these cases is that people, when they get fucked, they want to find out how they got fucked. Many people roll over and die, but other people don't stop. They're like insatiable until they get the answer. I'm one of those people.